studios in New York, here again is Jane Pauley.
Isn't it true that just because you live with people doesn't mean they know you, even if they're your parents? For the man you're about to meet, the years had done nothing to temper the hurt that lingered in his feelings for his father, until a terrible secret brought them together and made them a family again. Here's John Hockenberry.
48-year-old writer Richard Hoffman is a teacher, a poet, and a father. He is also a victim.
I couldn't bring it home, you know, I couldn't allow it to be part of who I am.
You could forgive Richard Hoffman for wanting to blot out large chunks of his troubled life, the loss of his mother from cancer, his two brothers from muscular dystrophy.
I knew that the story that I had to tell was not merely my story.
This is a tragic story of a boy who couldn't forgive himself. Richard had his own terrible secret, a secret he was terrified to tell his parents. They didn't make it easy. Richard says his father beat him, made him want to run and hide. Throughout a childhood full of brutality, Richard kept the secret that he was the victim of a horrible crime, a crime committed by someone close to the family, someone trusted by everyone in the community.
There was a lot of anger, a lot of fury in the house, a lot of rage, as well there might be, at the hand that had been dealt to this family.
A bad hand dealt to the head of the household. Richard's father struggled to survive in the small working-class town of Allentown, Pennsylvania. Every time he thought he'd seen the worst, something else would happen to his family.
If I would have turned my back and walked away from that, you know, God knows what would have happened then.
Did you ever think about it?
Oh, sure. Yeah, you think about it. You think, boy, it sure would be nice if I could just pack up here and get the hell out, but you can't.
I think my father made some heroic efforts to convince himself and all of us that we were normal, that this was the way of the world and we were just like all the families on TV.
But Richard knew the worst. With rage at his absent father and rage at the ugly secret he kept inside, Richard outwardly brought home the trophies for his brothers who were too sick to make the sports teams. Trophies to make his father proud. Football and Little League. All of Allentown loves sports. In this community, athletes, and especially their coaches, could do no wrong. Richard Hoffman learned the truth as a 10-year-old child.
Do you remember the first time you met Coach Feifel?
It seemed like everybody I knew was playing on that team. Everybody who was a good athlete was playing for his team.
A winning coach, John Feifel, everyone called him Tom. He was tough, with an ironclad power over his boys.
He would wear football spikes, and he'd come and stand on your stomach.
You're a 9-year-old kid with a Korean War veteran Little League coach.
Yeah.
Who's hardening your stomach by standing on it in a pair of football spikes.
Well,
that's America, teaching you how to be tough.
Yeah, well, teaching you what it means to be a man.
Lessons on manhood from a coach who preyed on little boys. It started one day after practice.
Do you remember the first time Coach Feifel showed you a dirty picture?
Yeah, it was in his car.
On the way to the ice cream parlor, Feifel showed Richard some pictures of naked women. It was just the beginning.
It was sort of our secret, and it was something he was sharing with me, and you like this. This is pretty cool, isn't it? And then at a certain point, there was no way out.
At Feifel's home, Richard says he was shown more pictures, slides, and pornographic movies. Finally, he turned his brutal attention to Richard's body. And above all, Richard was afraid that someone, worst of all the father he so wanted to please, would discover his secret.
One of the things that happened as a result of Feifel's abuse was that our relationship was ruptured.
A 10-year-old boy raped by his coach became a little boy who thought he had no one to talk to, who thought he was the bad guy.
If you opened your mouth with your secret, what would the effect of that have been?
I would be seen for the horrible young pervert that I had now become.
And that is how he would think of himself for the next 30 years. No one learned Richard's secret, but people in Allentown had always whispered about Coach Feifel. Even Richard's father, himself a Little League coach, had heard the rumors and said nothing.
You would say, that guy likes to fool around with little boys. But when you said fool around, you didn't mean actual sexual overtures. You meant maybe he likes to have 6 or 8 of them in the car so he can tell them dirty jokes and stuff. It didn't register that people would be that nasty to children.
And he had no idea that this coach would rape his son. But a few people in Allentown knew that while Richard Hoffman was still in high school, Coach Feifel was actually arrested for sodomizing another young boy.
June 16th, 1967. Mr. Feifel at that time is 37 years of age.
Jerry Procanin is a police detective. His first encounter with John Feifel was no rumor. It was a matter of public record.
Mr. Feifel was charged with sodomy under the old Pennsylvania Crimes Code. The family then declined, after the arrest, to have their son testify.
But without the victim's testimony, a quiet deal was cut back in '67. As Procanin explains, Feifel was allowed a lesser plea of disorderly conduct, so the charge of sodomy was dropped, the truth along with it.
When you pay a fine of disorderly conduct in Pennsylvania, like in many other states, you can go home and tell people that you had an argument with your neighbor and that's why you were arrested, and it's the end of the story.
Whatever the legal excuse, Coach Feifel was permitted to return to coaching despite his arrest for sodomizing a child. And not surprisingly, it happened again.
I arrested Mr. Feifel back in December of 1983, and it was for involuntary sexual deviant intercourse.
That's right, John Feifel was arrested again, 16 years later, for the same crime by the same detective.
Mr. Feifel got 18 months probation.
Probation because he was regarded by the courts as a first-time offender. Remember, the earlier charge was for disorderly conduct. And while the court should have been able to review his file containing the sodomy charge, incredibly, those files had been destroyed.
The cases from the early 60s, because of space limitations, were shredded.
During the 18 months he was on probation, Feifel's record remained a secret. His victims weren't talking, and the authorities' hands were legally tied. Feifel's seemingly quiet suburban life continued on, without interruption. When probation was up, it was as if nothing had ever happened.
He had a record, but he was a free man.
The secret had been erased except from the scarred minds and hearts of Coach Feifel's victims. By this time, Richard Hoffman was a man in his 30s. He had carried the scars of his rape through high school, then college, through the death of his brother Mike in 1970 and brother Bob just 2 years later. He struggled to escape the ugly person he was convinced he had become.
I would be anybody but that kid. That was the task, was to be anybody but him.
Because that kid was weak? Powerless?
Because he was weak, he was powerless, because he was ashamed. I mean, he couldn't look anybody in the eye.
How lost did you get?
Oh, I got very lost. I got very lost.
Drinking?
Sure, the drinking was, it's almost too simplified to say it was a way to hold the feelings at bay.
But to finally confront his demons, Richard would unleash all of his feelings in a meeting in 1990. Richard, the angry, bitter son, gave his father one last burden to carry.
Well, to be truthful, I thought my world came to an end.
In a face-to-face confrontation, Richard told his most painful stories. His father, for the first time, really listened.
He asked me whether I recalled some of the physical incidents between him and I as he was growing up.
But beyond all the family strife and childhood rage, there was the rape. Now his father would know the truth, and it made a much-feared dad tender.
I said, why didn't you come to me when it happened? And Dick's reaction was, all you would have done was beat me up.
For Richard, it was the end of a long struggle. For his father, it was just the beginning. Richard had closure. He had told his secret. He would now write it down in a memoir. But Richard's father was determined to set things right. And to do so, father and son together would take on an entire community.
There wasn't much I could do except to try to check a little bit to actually see, whether anybody else had the same story that Dick had.
What Richard and his father would find would stun an entire town. The conclusion to our story when we come back. Hoffman had finally revealed to his father a secret he'd carried for decades, that he'd been raped by his Little League baseball coach. But the crime was committed so long ago. Richard was a middle-aged man. What could he do about it now? The whole town was about to learn the answer. Here again is John Hockenberry.
I believe in the power of books to change people. I believe in the power of writing to change people, because
like any author, Richard Hoffman hoped his first book, a memoir called Half the House, would reach people. But the person he most wanted to reach was his father.
You liked it? Yeah, I liked the book. I did. And I took a big load off of his mind because he thought I was going to jump all over him. But I think it's a truthful book, and you can't fight very much with the truth.
The truth was a bombshell in Allentown. Hoffman's book named the man everyone called Coach Tom, John Feifel, as his abuser. And now, armed with his son's memoir, Richard Hoffman's father was determined to settle a score with the man who had hurt his boy so very long ago.
I just couldn't picture Dick had carried this secret with him for 30 or 40 years. Was he going to carry that, for the rest of his life? Or were there people out there who were going to step forward and say yes?
What father and son discovered was that Richard was not alone. Within a few weeks of the publication of Half the House, the calls started coming in.
Many of those calls were tearful. Sometimes it was 2 or 3 minutes before I got a chance to say anything.
Dozens of men, seemingly of all ages, all victims of Coach Feifel, coming forward now because of a book.
Children just came out of the woodwork to accuse him of these things.
But the most shocking part to both father and son was what neither of them could have imagined, that 40 years after Richard's abuse, John Feifel was still coaching and still abusing children in Allentown.
He said he'd never hurt us, but he did hurt us.
13-year-old Michael, molested by Feifel, would blow the whistle on this man, telling his story to the police. Michael also called Richard Hoffman. Richard remembers their first phone conversation. There were few words.
And he said, "Thanks." I said, "Okay." And he said, "No, I mean, thanks for writing that book. You made it stop."
That book changed your life, didn't it?
Yeah.
How?
It made me come out and tell the truth what happened.
A book made you brave.
Yeah.
It was as though a 40-year-old story was coming alive before its author's eyes. Richard Hoffman heard from a 12-year-old the same secret he had kept for most of his life. But this time, the ending would be different. Less than 2 months after the publication of Richard Hoffman's book, police arrested a frail 68-year-old man. Astonishingly, it was the same officer who had arrested Coach Feifel twice before who took him in.
I indicated to him that it would be in his best interest that perhaps if there were other boys that he cared to tell me about, that now would be the time to do so.
Feifel confessed to everything. Inside his suburban home, police seized a museum of pornography. There were dozens and dozens of pictures, all of young boys, a startling portrait of a longtime pedophile through the pictures of his hidden victims. But why had it taken 40 years to learn the truth?
A lot of times, if someone does know with pedophiles, it's like, let someone else go to the cops and tell them, I don't want to be the person. Let someone else. It's the proverbial, I really don't want to get involved syndrome.
A small town with a big secret. Even though there were people who knew all about John Feifel, Coach Tom, everybody called him, no one spoke out. So when he showed up here at the prestigious Mountainville Sports Association, once again the coach was brought on board. No background checks, not even a phone call.
Could someone made a call just to say, did you ever hear of a guy by the name of John Feifel? That would have set off 1,000 bells.
There are people who are threatened, very threatened by the revelations in the book. There are people who knew about this and did nothing. There are people who may have been actively complicitous with this man. and they have to be damned nervous now about what else will come out.
It all came down to 2 days in an Allentown courtroom. In the end, hundreds of people, mostly young boys, were prepared to testify against Coach Feifel. Richard couldn't tell the court what had happened to him. He was violated so long ago that the statute of limitations had run out. But for the first time in 30 years, he would be in the same room as the man who had raped him.
I was angry. I was really angry. I found myself shaken. I was in tears.
While the whole town awaited Feifel's sentence, Richard and his father understood they had come to the end of a long journey, one they had made together.
If he hadn't hung in with this, there'd be no story.
I have nothing but admiration for the way that Dick did it. I've got something to live for.
You feel like a father again?
Yeah, yeah.
Good feeling.
Sure is.
John Feifel was finally sentenced to 8 to 35 years in state prison. Richard Hoffman is now working on a second book, but he knows nothing can ever equal that first slim volume that changed so many lives.
To people who aren't writers, who don't know much about what it takes, would you rather have the Pulitzer Prize or that sentence?
All I have to do is look at one of those kids and the Pulitzer Prize shrinks pretty rapidly. For some of those boys, this stopped because the book was published and because I stuck to my guns about naming him in the book. That's wonderful.
8 to 35 means that Feifel must serve a minimum of 8 years behind bars, meaning he'd be 75 years old before he'll be eligible for parole.